Donderdag 15 Februarie, hoofstuk 6 of rather chapter 6 of Destiny. Matthias led his stick of men through the dark night. Every couple of 100 meters they would stop and listen to the night sounds, concentrating on the abnormal. There was nothing. It was just after 10 o'clock that evening curfew that he selected his position next to a medium-sized sauna. He judged the distance to the target at just over 800 meters. It will do. He signaled to the rear and watched closely as two men appeared with the base plate of the 82mm mortar, then another one fitting the tube in place, and lastly, the bipod was fixed. He did the adjustments himself, until he finally stood back satisfied and glanced at his watch. 5 minutes to go. It was deadly quiet, except for the occasional sound that reached them from the target area. He kept his eyes on his watch. It was time. At exactly 10:30 that evening, he let his hand drop on the shoulder of the man who was holding the mortar bomb. The bomb dropped into the tube, hit the strike pin and charged, exploded and sent the 82mm mortar into the night sky. Momentarily, it was light in the flash of the huge mortar, and almost immediately the next one dropped in the tube. Matthias held up his hand, stared at the base, saw the flash of the explosion well ahead of the rumbling sound of the exploding mortar that came rolling towards him. He made a quick adjustment. Realign the mortar, the base plate now secure. Go for it! As fast as they could manage, the crew sent bomb after bomb into the night sky until all 20 were airborne and in the process of exploding in the target area. Matthias grunted with satisfaction. Already one or more tents were ablaze with fire. They had successfully hit the target. For a moment longer they stood staring at the greying inferno, turned away and broke into a run north towards the border. By the time the Boers had recognized or reorganized, they would be safely in Angola. 10 kilometers away, Mamba was waiting with his 5-men stick. He had selected his position carefully, on a relative sharp turn in the road, the tarred road that connected Oshikati and Ondangwa. His attack plan was simple and consisted of two phases. First, a standoff bombardment of the living quarters at the base of 5-3 Battalion at Ondangwa, and the second phase was to intercept the very first vehicle that came from Oshikati to assist. He had quietly listened to Matthias's bombardment, heard the roll of explosions, and nodded. That was exactly what he had wanted, and he was grateful for the many hours of practice by Matthias and his mortar men. The RPG-7 rested on his knee. The projectile inserted. He would fire it. They could not afford to miss. He glanced back at his stick. They were as ready as could be, and he saw their white teeth as they acknowledged him. Soon he could hear the sound of a high revving engine, saw the faint lights in the distance. He waited until the fast approaching vehicle was a bare 200 meters away. Mamba lifted the RPG-7 on his right shoulder, tumbled the hammer back and aimed the rocket launcher just above and between the two headlights. He closed his right hand. The recoil sent a scorching flame to its rear, and the rocket flew straight. It hit the Buffel troop carrier and its radiator, sending a slug of molten copper and metal through the engine block. The shock of the explosion was tremendous. The Buffel left the road and started rolling. Over and over it went and edged against the night sky, Mamba saw the tumbling bodies until it finally gnashed to a stop some 20 paces from Mamba and his men. Now, he roared, and dropping the RPG launcher, he raced towards the troop carrier, which was resting on its side. He glanced inside the protected troop compartment, saw the stunned body of a soldier hanging from the straps. Fortunately, this one followed the rules by strapping in. To escape with the injured Boer would be extremely difficult. With a flick of his hand, he undid the shoulder straps and the soldier fell to the ground. Grabbing the soldier by one hand, he dragged the still stunned figure out. Vaguely, he heard the shots of his men as they finished off the injured few. He tied the soldier's hands and feet and pulled a sack over his head. "Leonard," he called urgently. A bulk figure knelt next to him. "Take him." Mamba had specifically selected Leonard for the job as he was the fittest and strongest of all those in the special units. Already a veteran of several skirmishes, he knew what to expect. A look towards the west showed more vehicles approaching, and Mamba stood up. "Time to go, stay close," and he led the way north at a stiff pace. He stopped every hour for a 10-minute break. Shortly before dawn, he made a 90-degree turn to the west before turning northwest an hour later. But he did not expect any intercepts soon. No one on the troop carrier had survived, and he knew that it would be some time before anyone realized that someone had been abducted. The prisoner soon regained consciousness, but the initial feeble struggle was quickly stopped with a few slaps to the bagged head. But he definitely endured much discomfort on Leonard's white shoulders. They crossed the border shortly after 9 o'clock. At the next break, Mamba realized that his men were exhausted and that even Leonard could not keep up much longer. "Let the prisoner walk," he decided, and cut the rope around the ankles. He tied a short length of rope to the prisoner's still tied hands, the other end to his own wrist. Their pace was much slower now. The prisoner stumbled and fell a couple of times, mumbling incoherently. Mamba slapped this prisoner with force and pulled the sack off his head and stared in shock. It was a woman. Her blonde hair started to come loose, disheveled and in total disarray. He saw the smudges of dried tears, the utter exhaustion in her blue eyes. "What the hell?" he exclaimed, and leaning forward, pulled the piece of cloth from her mouth. "Water," she croaked. Mamba slowly took the flask from his hip, unscrewed the top, and held it to her mouth. She gulped it down. Only a little though, and Mamba took it away, noticed the circle of shocked men around him. "We have captured a woman," Leonard stated the obvious. "I thought the soldier was less heavy than I would have expected." Mamba said nothing, continued to stare at the blonde girl, wondering how the hell it happened that their carefully executed plan had left him with a female. "What must we do now? Release her? Continue with her as our prisoner?" Never in his life could he guess that this will be possible. And what did she do on the troop carrier? His eyes roamed over her brown uniform, stopped at the twin stars of her rank, saw the medical insignia on the right-hand side of her chest. "What did you do on the troop carrier?" he asked brusquely. She stared back at him, and he saw the fear in her eyes. "I am a medical doctor," she began uncertainly. "I was sent out after an attack in Ondangwa to assist with the wounded. What are you going to do with me?" Mamba shook his head. I really don't know, but this I can tell you. If you try to escape or run away, I will kill you. Leslie Ann believed him. They reached the vehicles late that afternoon. Tom McLaughlin's life was in turmoil. Barely 14 days after his discharge from the Defence Force, he was about to get married to a girl he hardly knew, with a life worlds apart from the one he was used to. And he felt embarrassed that he had allowed himself to be bullied into this position, and in this modern day and age. He looked at the white church building with its thatched roof, saw the multitude of cars in the parking, the red carpet rolled from the pavement and up the steps where his bride would appear. He thought of Leslie Ann, the girl he was in love with, and his heart cringed at the thought of her blue eyes, the blonde hair, and he remembered her kiss. Tom tugged at his bow tie. He was nervous as well. It was much easier to face a platoon of Mamba's men than one bride in front of the pulpit. "Are you okay?" Snakes asked. "It looks as if you are going to jump without a parachute." "Don't mention it. This is one thing that I don't want to do, but I better get it over with. Where is Ben?" "Late as usual," Snakes replied, "but at least I thought that he will be on time today to see you off." They could already hear the clip-clop as the 4 horses with the coach were approaching, and Tom just got a glimpse of Cecile in her white bride's gear. A quick glance at the entrance confirmed that most of the 800 guests were already seated, and they hurried to the rear entrance of the stately church. Tom walked straight in with Snakes on his heels, took up position in front of the pulpit. They faced the main entrance. There was still no sign of Ben. In the front row were his father and mother. Both appeared strained as they sat there unsmiling, in contrast with all the happy faces in the church. Then, to one side, he noticed a rowdy-looking bunch, his friends from the unit. There was a consternation at the main entrance. Cecile had arrived. Tom felt a contraction in his chest and realized that he was making the biggest mistake of his life. He wanted to shout, to stop it, but no noise escaped his lips. He realized that he was sweating profusely. Next to him, Snakes was as calm as could be, a huge smile on his face, his eyes darting over the audience at the large number of beautiful and unattached female guests. And then there she was, beautiful and happy, the long trail of her dress lifted by 2 bridesmaids, equally happy and smiling. He tried to smile, but nothing happened. He had frozen. He jerked as the organ began to play. "Here comes the bride." As if in a dream, he watched Cecile as she started down the aisle, coming towards him between the lines of flowers which probably cost more than a month's pay. Cecile was 3 meters away when Ben burst into the church. "Captain!" he shouted urgently. The organ went quiet. Cecile stopped and the earth came to a stop, or so it seemed to Tom. He noticed his father slowly rising, and then Ben was at his side. Leslie Ann was captured by SWAPO. The church was deadly quiet. The words reached each and every one. "What?" Tom seemed shocked, not understanding. "The doctor, Captain, the lieutenant from Oshikati. She was taken by SWAPO." A swear word escaped Snake's mouth, and his mates started to file for the exit. Tom stood gaping at Ben, and as realization dawned on his face. Leslie Ann captured! Impossible! How? Where? And when? He had to go to her. He had to go and find her. Cecile, he said with sudden urgency, I'm sorry, I am so sorry, but I have to go. Her mouth flew open. She turned scarlet. How dare you? Were the last words he heard before he ran out of the church. He was oblivious to the pandemonium that erupted in the church. Tom! His father shouted from the door. Tom! He stopped and looked back and saw the anger and humiliation on his father's face. If you leave now, you will never come back. I disown you. You will not inherit a single cent from me. His mother appeared behind Barry McLachlan. There was a smile on her face. Tom discarded the bow tie even before he reached the car. Snakes had the door open for him, and Ben was limping as fast as he could and got into the back. They were surrounded by their friends from the unit, comrades in arms, brothers in arms, his friends, standing in a circle, clapping, and Snakes drove off. Snakes and Ben dropped him off at the D.F. Malan airport in Cape Town. They had discussed what needed to be discussed. They would follow suit the next day. They would first collect their equipment at the unit in Langebaan. As well, it was well after midnight when Tom hammered on the door of the General Commanding of the Special Forces in Valhalla, Pretoria. They talked till the wee hours of the morning. He caught the 8 o'clock flight from Waterkloof Air Force Base, and by 12 he was sitting in the office of the Major Peter Fourie, the officer commanding of Fort Fire, still dressed in his wedding attire. It is already 3 days, Tom, he warned. She would have been evacuated to Luanda by now. No, Major, wait, not yet. I know that area well. It could have taken them 3 days to reach Kahama. Tell me what you want to do, Tom. Chapter 7. 5 minutes out came the voice of the pilot. Tom leaned forward and touched each of his men. Wordlessly, they did a final quick check of their equipment. It wasn't really necessary because they were ready. Dan Pienaar had to reach for a landing zone, and with the flight engineer hanging halfway out, he managed the drop in a small clearing. As the last recce disappeared into the night, he lifted the Puma almost vertically until they cleared the trees and flew off to the west. He would follow a different flight plan back to base. Tom kept his men in all-around position for a full 30 minutes. Then, satisfied that all was clear, he fetched out his recta compass and led his men due south at a controlled pace. He had to figure it out somehow. Almost all possible routes out of Kahama were covered, except for 1 or 2 almost non-existent ones. Barely more than a twin-track dirt road, it was neither mapped nor used, but if he knew about them, then Mamba would do. With the help of a large force, Mamba would easily break through and Leslie Ann would be gone. But Tom doubted that. With the looming South African threat, it was unlikely that the Cuban commander would risk sending out a large force. Thanks to Colonel Lowe, who was putting increasing pressure on Kahama, Tom thought. The Cubans dared not weaken their forces. Mamba would have to use another method to bring his prisoner out. The way Tom figured it was that Mamba would try to get through with the least possible attention. By using the unknown roads, the least used ones and the ones few knew about, his chances were best. He would suspect that the area would be crawling with commandos. Therefore, he would use 1 or 2 armed, although highly mobile vehicles in order to avoid detection by air. He would travel by night and try to reach Shibemba and safely in 1 night. Tom checked the compass, selected a new star to navigate and lengthened his stride. He was out of shape. He thought as the heavy burden of his pack started to take effect. He wiped the sweat from his face. It was going to be a long night. Behind him, his men followed in single file, keeping in sight distance. Not a sound was heard, except for the occasional crunching of a boot on stone. Everyone was busy with his own thoughts. The safety of Leslie Ann rested heavily upon them. The reasoning of the captain was sound. If Mamba would try to break out, it would be along this way. Then it would only take their superior training, expertise, and wits to get the doctor away. They reached the road by 2:30. It was barely recognizable as a road, but closer inspection revealed the two faded tracks as it whirled through the rocky Angolan countryside. The team went down, facing in opposite directions. Snakes hunched closely behind him, and Tom gave the silent signal that the two of them should go and recce possible positions for the ambush. When the rest of the team were warned, they rose quietly and set off into the darkness. Reaching a slight rise, they stopped. From here, it would be possible to plan. With the night vision binoculars to his eyes, Tom studied the terrain with deep concentration. First, he had no guarantee that Mamba would use this road, but somehow deep inside he knew that this was the road. This was the last and maybe only chance to free Leslie Ann. While appraising the terrain for his ambush position, he sent Snakes back to fetch the men. An almost sheer drop of 3 meters on one side and a kopje behind them would prevent any vehicles from escaping or driving around the ambush. All he had to do was to blow the front suspension off the leading vehicle and cut off the escape route of any other vehicles. But how on earth they would succeed in getting Leslie Ann out of the armed car without her being hurt was something different. Snakes returned with the rest of the party, and Tom ordered the men to work. With painstaking care, he planted 2 mines on top of each other where he wanted the leading vehicle to stop. The thin electrical wires of the remote control ran underground to his position. 2 more mines were planted 30 and 60 yards back to serve as a cut-off measure in case there were 2 or more vehicles. Then Tom placed the men in pairs alongside the killing zone. Not exactly the perfect numbers to jump an ambush, he thought, really, as he dug his trench. Their chances were slight. Even if they were successful to stop the vehicle, the return fire would be enormous. Their own fire had to be high as not to risk hitting Leslie Ann. May God help them. They waited until dawn, and much to Tom's dismay, there was still no sign of any approaching vehicle. Uncertainty gnawed at his mind. What if he wasn't correct in his reasoning? What if Mamba had followed a different route? Or if they had already evacuated Leslie Ann? Tom sighed. There were no means to know. They just had to wait. Maybe that night. The midday heat was suffocating, and the stench of stale urine in the prisoner bunker was unbearable. The half-filled toilet bucket in the corner crawled with maggots and blue bottles. There was a buzzing sound of hundreds of mosquitoes in the confined space of the cell. Light filtered through the cracks in the thick wooden door, and every time a vehicle passed nearby, sand spilled through the rafters to the filthy floor below. Leslie Ann sat flat on her behind with her arms around her drawn-up legs, her head resting on her knees. Her hair was an entangled mess, with a dust of dirt mingling with the sweat of the past 72 hours. Streaks of dirt beneath her eyes betrayed the tears that she had spilled in the quiet and loneliness of the sand-walled bunker. Her mouth was dry, and to swallow was painful. At times the thirst became so immense that she wanted to tear the wooden door to pieces to overcome the frustration and helplessness. But she soon learned it was of no use. The guards at the door took no notice of her thumping and shouting. It was useless. She was completely at the mercy of her captors. After the initial shock, fear, and madness, she was overcome by calm, resolute feeling. She was determined to stay calm throughout the whole ordeal. Panic would only serve to make her more vulnerable and would drain her reserves. A small black object slowly crawled up her bare foot. With a hoarse croak, she caught it between her thumb and forefinger. To her horror, she saw that it was a tick, and she squashed it between her thumbnails. She shivered as she dropped it on the sand. Lord, what a mess, she thought, as she stared at her dirty hands and the traces of dirt under her fingernails. She craved a bath, to wash away the dirt and to feel better. If only she could awake from this terrible dream. But then, this was no dream. The most horrible and humiliating experience that could happen to any soldier had befallen her. And at that moment, her hatred was so intense that she felt she could strangle the first enemy face she saw. Then came utter despair, and she felt the tears well up in her eyes again. What would her parents do? Oh God, would they be able to take it? And what about Tom? She sat desolate and forlorn on the corner of the makeshift prison, her sorrow and pity too much to bear, her body shaking as she sobbed uncontrollably. Questions and fear occupied her thoughts. It was considerably later when she heard the approach of footsteps. She quickly composed herself. She will not cry in front of any of them. When the door swung open, she remained in the corner of the cell, her head held defiantly with undisguised hatred in her eyes. It was Mamba and the Cuban officer she didn't know. They stared at her for a moment, as if they wanted some reaction from her. She only glared at them, her emotions under control. Mamba said something in a strange language to the Cuban, who just shrugged with a curt reply. Then Mamba knelt in front of her, and Leslie Ann was beside by a sudden fright. But when he spoke, the tone of his voice made her relax. I'm not going to ask you how you are, for I know that the conditions are poor and unbecoming a woman, even if she is the enemy. He paused briefly. Bring her some water, enough of it, he told Tanacio, and returned his attention to her. We are going to move out tonight, and I sincerely hope that by tomorrow night your conditions will be better. But then, it all depends on you. If you behave, no problem. But if you try to run, I will kill you. Leslie Ann winced as he uttered the last words, but she remained staring in his eyes, and it was Mamba who averted his gaze and stood up. I shall arrange for food and enough to drink before we move out. Be prepared. Tanacio returned with a mug of water, and she had to control herself not to grab it from his hand. With a small show of defiance, she took the mug from him. But the moment she tasted it, she couldn't care any more. She gulped down the delicious water, spilling some at the corners of her mouth. When it was finished, she wanted to cry out for more. It was the grin on Tanacio's face that prevented her from asking for more. Without a word, they turned and left. The maize was sticky and tasteless, but she forced it down her throat. When she was finished, she felt a little better. I must survive. I must keep my head. I must eat, she told herself. Standing over the bucket, legs apart and knees slightly bent, she relieved herself. There was no paper, and with a disgusted grunt, she pulled up her pants and closed the buttons. They had taken away her belt, shoes, and bra, and she was grateful that her trousers fitted tightly. Making certain that her shirt was buttoned high and tight enough to hide her breasts, she sat down again. She was ready. They came to fetch her, and half an hour later, much to her dismay, the dreaded blindfold was once again bound tightly over her eyes. She stumbled a little over the unfamiliar ground, but they led her without ceremony to the waiting vehicle, where she was pushed through an open door. She bumped her head painfully, and under her bare feet she felt the hot metal of an armed car. She was pushed into the seat and strapped in. The blindfold was removed, and she blinked gratefully. In the dim interior light, she made out several armed troops sitting opposite her, sweat glistening their black faces, their expressions grim and unfriendly. Next to her was a Cuban woman, also in uniform. She smiled at Leslie Ann as to comfort her. "No worry," her English came haltingly. "We leave now." Leslie Ann closed her eyes. "Oh Lord, please help me." Mamba stood out through the turret and watched as the last of his convoy took up their respective positions and turned to Tenacio on the ground. "Muchas gracias, amigo." "The ground forces?" "In position," Tenacio smiled. "Good hunting and good luck." Mamba smiled thinly. "I'm going to need it. Buenas noches, comrade. Regards to Gina." Daar's hy, môre is dit Vrydag, dan lees ons verder uit Destiny. Mooi aand, dankie dat jy like, subscribe, share en die bel button druk.